I never take it for granted that we all understand what we're talking about. So I thought I would just begin by defining inequality. And I'm using a definition from the Oxford Dictionary, but also one which the United Nations has used in its work. Inequality, the state of not being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. The United Nations goes on to say that often that term inequality is prone to confusion in public debate, as it tends to mean different things to different people. So today we're going to talk about reduced inequalities. We're going to talk about disabilities and the labor market. We're going to talk about social capital and youth violence. We're going to talk about disaster reduction and how this affects those with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. And we're going to talk about sexual and reproductive health and how this fits in with the SDGs. Of course, interlaced in through all of that, this cross-cutting, this integral issue of gender and gender inequality. I myself would have loved to see probably a focus on that in the papers and something to bear in mind as we go forward. But definitely not something that we can escape discussing today. I'm under strict orders for 15 minutes. I know at least one presenter has already said, oh, I was told 30, but we're going to try to stick to 15 minutes. I was told to be strict also. And I will not, of course, try to staunch or cut off discussion, but I'm going to ask that we try to be as disciplined as we possibly can. Again, sorry, I'm going to also, I can give them 2 minutes each. If you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourselves, because again, I'm at a disadvantage. I know I didn't really get a background or profiles on the presenters, so I know only as much as those in the audience know. And as you can see, I'm the representative for UN Women Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean. We're based in Barbados. And we have 5 presenters today. At least three of them come from the academy. One is from the civil society, a foundation, and one is a UN colleague from the UNFPA. So I'm going to ask Mr. Rashad Brathwaite to come forward. He's going to speak on SDGs, disability, and the labor market in Barbados. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just by way of introduction, my name is Rashad Brathwaite. I'm an attorney at law by profession. I lie between academia and civil society. So part of this research really originated from a discussion with a new organization by the name of EverAble, and they're looking at establishing a research and policy base. So we wanted to know what is the data on labor market participation of persons with disabilities in Barbados? Simple question, which proved and provided some interesting answers. So my background is in international development and human rights. I'm a UE graduate and graduate of the University of Warwick. So I am managing both my laptop and the PowerPoint, so bear with me. So the key questions for this research, we wanted to know what are the goals and targets under the SDGs and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities related to the labor market? How does the data measure up in establishing a baseline for SDG compliance? So at the heart of the SDGs, a lot of focus on data and making sure that our targets are being met and that they're being effectively, but what's the baseline? Where are we starting from? So how to look at the data, we'll go through the key findings and trends, then seek to explain the trends. So in part, it was a desk review, and then it was a policy analysis and legislative review. So that's where the context for the trends and the data comes from policy and legislative framework, and other contextual factors. So under that section, I'll be having a bit of a discussion about the education system and the way that it feeds into this discussion. Because as we can appreciate, the SDGs and human rights more generally, their interconnections are fundamentally important. So if I don't have access to education, then my access to the labor market is impaired on that end. Also, there's a bit of a gender lens as well. So because we do know that gender and disability, that they do come together to provide additional or complicated intersectional hurdles. So general overview of Barbados, relatively stable democracy, population of about 280,000, high levels of HDI, so currently 57th, peak at 29 on the HDI index. Unemployment currently is about 11.9%. And as it relates to disabilities, and we'll get into it a bit more, there's a very weak legislative framework. There's social protection, and then as it relates to protection from discrimination, the Employment Rights Act is the only legislation really that treats to persons with disabilities. So first, the SDGs, we'll look at the indicators and targets so that we then assess Barbados against that context. So goal 4, 8, 10, 11, 16, and 17, inclusive and equitable quality education, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work, reduce inequality within countries under goal 10, and we'll be focusing on 4, 8, 10, and 17 as it relates to the labor market. But of course, we can't have that discussion in the abstract without looking at access to how do I get to work, how are laws made about disability. So we're also then looking at participation throughout all levels of society. So the president of the Senate is Carrie Ann Eiffel, and she is she's living with disability. She's blind, so she's been one of the key advocates as it relates to disabilities within Barbados. Now, this did not translate well between my laptop and this Mac to Microsoft. So under goal 8, full and productive employment, we want to know the average hourly earnings of female and male employees by occupation, age, and person with disabilities, the unemployment rate, similarly desegregated, sex, age, and person with disabilities. Goal 10, elimination of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. So I'm just looking at the targets. And then goal 17, fundamentally, this will ultimately frame a lot of what we're discussing under this presentation, the data. Do we have relevant, timely, sufficient, accurate data? The short answer, we don't. So what do we know? So we know that according to the last census in 2010, of course, quite dated, there were about 12,000 persons living with disabilities, greater representation of women, so about 55% to 60% of persons with disabilities as reported were women, as compared to a smaller portion of men. When we then looked at disability by age, and this is particularly relevant as it relates to the labor market, 48% of persons with disability fell within the traditional labor market, 6% below that, and 65% retirement age above that. Now, of course, the data set doesn't match exactly traditional labor market, but it's a close enough average for our purposes. And then we see significant incidents of, so there's a relationship between age and disability, with disability prevalence rising exponentially from 0 to 4 age range, so 100 to 200 persons, up until 60, 64 plus, which contributes to about 5,000 of the 11,000 persons with disabilities. So that when we're looking at it, for my purposes, in terms of looking at the labor market, I'm primarily focused on the 20 to 50 to 54 age range, 60 age range. But of course, the data between various data sets doesn't exactly match up. So the data that we have from the housing census, I'm looking at my laptop while moving the PowerPoint. So the housing census tells us a bit. It tells us where persons with disabilities are located, so I can give you the rural versus urban spread of disabilities. I can tell you the type of disability and the age of persons with disabilities and the types of disabilities that, and the relationship. But for the most part, that really is it as far as the housing census goes. So looked at three primary instruments: the Country Assessment of Living Conditions, Housing and Population Census, and the Continuous Labor Force Survey. The Continuous Labor Force Survey would tell us that data between censuses. So between 2010 to 2020, where we would get that information as it relates to labor market participation, quite ordinarily, would be the Continuous Labor Survey. But guess what? The Continuous Labor Survey does not capture any data on disability. Any data, any at all. So all of my research questions as it relates to the relationship between earnings and disabilities, the relationship between earning, education level, and disability, the relationship between gender and disability, we do not have the data set to answer those questions. So policy making, therefore, stems from anecdotal base, occasionally less than a firm evidence base, we'll call it that. The population census had the capacity, because it's based, the definition of disability is based from the Washington Group. But we did not disaggregate the data appropriately. So the instrument was capable of collecting the data, but ultimately the presentation focused on disaggregation by types of disability, location, age, and it didn't go any further. So outside of the context of disability, I could tell you a bit about the substantial increase of earning power with tertiary education. I could tell you about the relationship between having a child and earnings. I could tell you about relationship status, but we simply have very little to work with. The Country Assessment of Living Conditions identified persons with disabilities as a vulnerable group, and appropriately so. But the only data that is captured is of a qualitative nature, focus groups. So throughout the country assessment, we see broader trends, but again, this was not reflected in the quantitative data. So we're making policy, and I'll come to laying out what is the current policy framework, and how does that policy framework both construct disability and act on disability? What is a review of our policy tell us about the way in which we see disability? So, the only data I could find from the desk review for the employment rates of persons with disability, and I can't confirm this, was a UN presentation which happened to be made available online, and that was a reported rate of 33%, the employment rate being 33% for persons with disabilities, as compared with the national average of the unemployment rate of persons without disabilities is currently, did I say the unemployment rate? Yeah, the unemployment rate is 11%. That's the national average. The unemployment rate for young persons, as we know across the region, that trends upwards towards 30%. But we really had no further data. That's the only data, and I can't confirm that. The government's labor department, in terms of inactive population, there's a 5% of persons who, on the basis of incapacity, are not part of the labor market. So we have very little to work with in terms of not just knowing the active labor force, but understanding retreat from the labor market, so that those persons wouldn't even be counted when we're looking at the employment rate. So to what extent do our policies push persons to retreat from the labor market entirely? I'll come to my experiences with trying to gather greater data, and it neatly encapsulates the thrust of this presentation. So upon my desk review, I called, there's a government body designated to work with persons with disabilities, the National Disabilities Unit. So I called the National Disabilities Unit to inquire whether they collected any independent data, since our national data collection did not do so. They did not. So I asked, do you have any personal insight into the percentage of persons with disabilities working, what fields they're working in, how do persons with disabilities in Barbados sustain themselves? The response was this. Well, it's in Beijing, so I'll explain. Ain't a whole lot of them. Ain't a whole lot of them. I was temporarily stunned. That is, there are not a lot of persons working. And in a whole lot of them is a nice encapsulation of what policies do we have in a whole lot of them, what data do we have in a whole lot of them, and that generally was the thrust. So then I wanted to know, what is the policy framework that drives this? What policies are we making at the national level? And as a desk review, I'm obviously limited in terms of policy slippage, what we write on paper, and for policymakers, academic language and review of policy documents are at times very fascinating. Very much like poetry, there was a green tree, and the English literature teacher is going to tell you all of its meaning. And as a policymaker, you know that sometimes you wrote a document at 2 a.m., you're a bit sleepy, and it wasn't within the meaning in which academia at times can read it. So there's going to be slippage inherently in my assessment of the policy framework, but it still has some key revealing findings. So, not a lot of them. Data, missing. So 3 primary frameworks that I'm going to be assessing. The National Strategic Plan, which is to guide development between 2005 to 2020, the Barbados Human Resource Development Strategy, which is for 2011 to 2016, and the National Employment or Labor Policy, which is the most recent document. I don't have it referenced here, but the Medium-Term Development and Growth Strategy, that also put considerable focus on persons with disabilities, but I understand and frame the treatment of disabilities within our policy scope under what I frame as strategies of optionality. How do we render the obligations, so-called, relating to... So, I'll give you a bit of a background in terms of strategies of optionality. While I was doing my master's, I was interested in the international economic framework, and particularly as it relates to the Caribbean, looking at tech transfer. In every instantiation of Caribbean exchange for what was going to be very onerous provisions, so whether it was WTO, whatever it was, there was always the promise of tech transfer. If we look at the discussion that we're having, the Durban Conference on Racism, the conversation about reparations, there's a certain framing whenever we're dealing with politically weaker groups. How do we engage in the performance of governance without doing? So how do we render these policies fluid, boundless, but present? How do we do that? So the next slide is a jarring example of the way in which the framing of disabilities policy has a direct impact on its implementation. So The 1.5 under the National Strategic Plan speaks to improving the quality of life of the aged and differently abled. So if you look at the targets, we see a substantial increase in the number of disabled persons employed in decent and quality jobs, a significant increase in the representation of the disabled and aged in national forums. In the same document, where we're looking at building social capital, we see 80% of persons aged 18 to 30 either having enrolled in or having a tertiary education, 100% literacy rate, 100% certification, internationally recognized accreditation agencies by 2008, 100% access to computers, and then, but wait, there's more. There are indicators. Number of accreditation agencies, social statistics generated in the education sector. There are no indicators in the national strategy as it relates to disabilities. There were no timeframes. There was nothing concrete. There was nothing measurable about these goals. And it's consistent across all of the documents. So whether we're looking at the human resource development strategy, whether we're looking at the medium-term growth. So that's an area as advocates that we have to be invested in making sure that our goals are measurable. Because in the absence of a substantial increase, we don't know what a substantial increase is. So it is that sort of inclusion without meaningful enforcement possibility. So I frame these as strategies of optionality. So you have semantic optionality, and then you can have enforcement optionality, where institutions which are required to work in the area have very limited mandate. So there you have the National Strategic Plan. Just run through that. Just a quick zoning in. What we also see in review of the policies is an incoherence between policies. So the human resource development strategy, for example, speaks in very broad languages to ensuring that persons living with disabilities, that they reach their capacity, they reach their maximum capacity. So a capacity approach, excellent. What we then see in the national labor policy is an exclusive focus on greater inclusion of persons with disabilities in TVET education, important though it be. You see this kind of what my cousin who is disabled refers to as the soft bigotry of low expectations, so that in the absence of a greater framework, we see no great thrust to ensure that persons with disabilities, that they're appropriately mainstreamed within our education system, and that they have equal opportunity to access tertiary education. So when we then relate to the data about greater earning potential with education, then we see the problematic there. And I'll just, I had to rely of necessity on narrative methodologies quite a bit in the absence of data. And just last year, there was a young guy, he was born deaf, and he went to one of the dedicated schools for deaf kids. And so between age 3 to 10, he attended. At the age of 10, he got a cochlear implant, so he could now hear. Having been in the school system, he said, well, common interest is coming up. I would like to take common interest and transition into mainstream secondary school. There's no need for me to remain within the segregated school system because there are no accommodations which are required for me at the secondary school. He was denied the opportunity to sit common entrance because it was felt that he was not adequately prepared. And this is in the context of him having been in the school system for 7 years. So that part of the context of why we're seeing the higher trends of unemployment, etc., is the systematic failure of persons with disabilities in the education system. And when we look at the UPR and the report on the CRC, it is astounding that we do not know how many children are within the mainstream school system and the dedicated units with disabilities. We simply do not know, even in the context of that being an environment which should be conducive to self-capturing. So my time is up. just in terms of quick recommendations, we need to have a greater framework for data. It is not that the instruments are incapable of data collection. We simply have not made it a political priority. So in 2020, where the census come in, the organization Ever Able, they're looking to petition and partner with the statistical unit to ensure that there is greater inclusion of this data. In terms of legal protection, there was a white paper in 2003. There are 4 bills which are currently awaiting, which are before the Parliament. That's since 2005. So we also see very weak political will to engage. So a green paper in 2003 has not yet borne fruit. We also see in 2003, there was then a promise that the disability survey was ongoing. The specific survey was ongoing. In the CRC report of 2016, it is still ongoing. So there's a need for considerable pressure from civil society to ensure that government so participates. So those are just some of the recommendations. I'd be happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brathwaite. I think you gave us an excellent start to our panel, touching all those bases with which, unfortunately, we're familiar when it comes to those who are socially excluded, whether you are disabled, whether you are a child, whether you're poor or whether you're a woman. I'm not sure if maybe Floyd can tell us when he comes up, but I think what you have found, I'm very interested to hear that disability has a female face in Barbados. I know that in Jamaica we have probably around 200,000 persons living with disabilities. Not sure what the disaggregation, it's much more than that now. Good, well, that was 2011. So that's what I was going to say. I'm sure now that we also know. But certainly as far as being disproportionately affected by unemployment, I think those, we're probably in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, 84%, Latin America and the Caribbean, 84% of those living with disabilities are in poverty. And so we are dealing with a major development challenge. We're dealing with stereotypes, we're dealing with stigma, social exclusion, discrimination, and probably the worst sin of all, no data. So when the Bayesians say, ain't much of them, meaning that, it's just a few of them, so why bother? We know we're in serious trouble. Alvinel Matthew. Okay, so one of our presenters is not present, I say as yet. So that means everybody getting a little extra time. I did give Mr. Brathwaite, and I have to say thanks very much for his discipline. I did give him a little extra time. Mr. Floyd Morris, it is my great pleasure to ask you to come to the podium, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Alison, for your kind introduction, and I'm very happy to see you again. Our friendship goes back to Department of Government here at the University of the West Indies. I am really heartened and happy to be here to participate in this conference today. And just via introduction, I am currently a senator in the Parliament of Jamaica. I've been a senator in the Parliament since 1998, and during the previous administration I served as president of the Senate. I was also Minister of State in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security for 7 years. I am currently the coordinator for the UWI Center for Disability Studies, and I recently completed a PhD in government focusing on political communication at the University of the West Indies here. I was Jamaica's lead negotiator on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations between 2002 and 2007. So I have a fair bit of understanding of the convention based on my participation in those discussions. Today, my presentation will focus on the situation on an inclusive and equitable and prosperous Caribbean, the case of persons with disabilities. And in this presentation, I will focus on examination of 3 countries: Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados. So I was very connected to the presentation by Mr. Brathwaite. Nothing about us without us is the global mantra for persons with disabilities. The statement articulates the view that no development, whether it is through policies, legislations, or programs relating to persons with disabilities, should take place without the inclusions of persons with disabilities. The global mantra has been embraced by the community of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean and is enunciated by different groups representing the members of this vulnerable community. But how serious is this expression taken by policymakers and those who are in authority in the Caribbean? Are policymakers making efforts to transform the lives of persons with disabilities? Is progress being made to build a genuinely inclusive society for persons with disabilities in the region? In order to answer these questions, I sought to do an analysis of efforts by 3 English-speaking Caribbean countries to cater to the needs of persons with disabilities. In doing this, I examined where each country is in terms of implementing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and at the same time, assess the efforts of policymakers to include programs for persons with disabilities as a means of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. For the SDGs to be effectively implemented, that is, inclusive of persons with disabilities, the 8 guiding principles of the CRPD must be utilized. In this context, 3 member countries of the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, that have signed and ratified the CRPD and the SDGs are assessed. These are the largest English-speaking islands in the Caribbean and have a cumulative population of over 5 million individuals. Approximately 80% of the population of persons with disabilities reside within these 3 Caribbean countries. But who are persons with disabilities? Various definitions have been proffered for persons with disabilities. For different countries, the meaning will vary. However, for the purpose of this presentation, the standard reference of the CRPD is germane. The CRPD states that persons with disabilities include those individuals with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation on an equal basis with others. The World Health Organization and the World Bank Report 2011 estimates that between 15 to 17% of the world population constitute persons with disabilities. And in Jamaica, what we have been doing is to use that estimate to match it against the Jamaican population to come up with a working target of persons with disabilities, because just as with other Caribbean jurisdictions, we have been having problem with the data. The census data have not been able to accurately capture the population of persons with disabilities. The CRPD was ready for signature in 2007, and Jamaica was the first country in the world to sign and ratify this convention. Subsequently, Other countries within the Caribbean have signed and ratified. These include Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. These countries are now obligated to honor the provisions of this convention that is designed to promote, protect, and ensure the rights of persons with disabilities. There are 8 core principles that underpin this treaty, and these are listed, and you can see it on the slide presentation, and in time, I won't go through those. You can see them on the slide. All these principles are axiological to the transformation of the lives of persons with disabilities. The Sustainable Development Goal. In 2015, the United Nations agreed to 17 Sustainable Development Goals with the primordial aim of creating an inclusive world for all. Whilst there is no specific goal relating to persons with disabilities, they have been crafted in such a way that they include all groups within the global society. In the context of this paper, the primary focus will be on goals 4, 8, and 11. These are ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all, and make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. These goals constitute some of the indispensable development needs of persons with disabilities. Indeed, for the lives of persons with disabilities to be meaningfully converted in the Caribbean, focus must be placed on education, employment, and access to public infrastructure. This is what these 3 goals are about. And they will be used as a means of assessing where we are in the English-speaking Caribbean, and will be juxtaposed against the 8 guiding principles of the CRPD. Education on persons with disabilities in the Caribbean. According to the World Bank, education is undoubtedly an intrinsic means of transforming the lives of any vulnerable group. It is that tool that provides individuals with the skill sets to participate in a meaningful way in the development of their society. It is the great social equalizer and enabler. It is therefore understandable why it is cited in the SDG as a fundamental priority for governments across the world. Similarly, it is included in the CRPD as a major responsibility for state parties. According to Professor Trevor Monroe, countries within the English-speaking Caribbean emerged out of a similar political construct. They were all under British colonial rule, and based on their hegemonic design, they have preserved and maintained a similar education system. This education system was designed at a time when persons with disabilities were seen as individuals who could not offer much to society. They were thus seen as individuals to be dependent on governments to provide for them. It was an environment that legitimized and reinforced the welfarist perspective of disability. Consequently, educational institutions were not designed to include persons with disabilities. In fact, according to Dr. Susan Henderson, a segregated system of education was promoted. It was not until the post-colonial era, that is after 1962, that persons with disabilities were being accepted in the regular educational institutions. There have been 3 approaches to the education of persons with disabilities in the English-speaking Caribbean: special schools, integrated schools, and inclusive schools. Special schools offer education and training exclusively to persons with disabilities. Integrated schools are regular schools where special classrooms are assigned to teach persons with disabilities. Inclusive education is where persons with disabilities are taught in the same classes alongside other students without a disability. All of the different approaches are present in the 3 countries under review. Conspicuously, all of the educational institutions from the colonial era had no access features for persons with disabilities, save and except for those that were exclusively built for persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities are now being included at all levels of the educational system, although not at the pace that is required. The same experience is in Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago, because I was referring particularly to Jamaica. The process of inclusion is impeded by lack of resources from government to make the educational institutions responsive to the needs of persons with disabilities. Resources are needed in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago to ensure that schools become physically accessible to persons with disabilities, provide trained teachers who are able to relate to these individuals, and the provision of modern technologies to assist them in their learning experience. In the case of the last, as it relates to technology, in Jamaica, through the Universal Service Fund, a special fund that has been created to provide greater internet access to citizens across Jamaica, support is being given to persons with disabilities to access modern technologies that will aid in their educational development. Since the 2000s, these 3 countries have been putting in place a more inclusive policy and legislative framework for persons with disabilities to enhance their educational experience. In 2000, the Parliament of Jamaica adopted a national policy for persons with disabilities, and in 2014, the Disabilities Act was approved by the Houses of Parliament. That legislation is not yet being enforced, but it has been approved by the Parliament. Both of these made special provisions for education of individuals with disabilities, and the responsibility for the implementation of the national policy and the legislation falls under the aegis of the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities. In Barbados, there is the Barbados White Paper on Disabilities, and this policy document, among other things, is a guide for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in educational institutions. The country is currently putting in place legislation to protect the rights of and dignity of persons with disabilities. The Barbados Council for Persons with Disabilities has oversight responsibilities for implementing these programs and policies. In Trinidad and Tobago, there is a special policy for persons with disabilities, and this covers the education of these individuals. There is the Equal Opportunities Act that gives some protection to persons with disabilities where their education is concerned. The Disabilities Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister in Trinidad and Tobago has carriage for these initiatives. Efforts to have an inclusive education for persons with disabilities in these English-speaking countries are, however, going at a snail's pace and will have to undergo a greater degree of urgency amongst policymakers if the CRPD and the SDGs are to be realized. Inclusive and sustainable employment for persons with disabilities. The employment landscape is also in an unimpressive state for persons with disabilities. The majority of persons with disabilities in the 3 countries under mention in this paper are unemployed. In Jamaica, a socio-economic study conducted by the Ministry of Labor and Social Security revealed that over 91% of respondents were unemployed. Information from Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago are pointing in a similar direction. The high levels of unemployment amongst this population contributes to the significant poverty and inequality that confronts them on a daily basis. According to the World Bank, when persons with disabilities are poor, they are unable to acquire the basic necessities that will allow them to function daily, and this further retards their ability to participate in meaningful employment. The inaccessible education environment is also a contributory factor to the high levels of unemployment among persons with disabilities. When persons with disabilities do not have the necessary educational qualification, they are further restricted and isolated from the labor market. The homogeneous nature of disability causes the situation of low employment amongst this population to be mirrored across the English-speaking Caribbean. Again, the region is failing in its quest to realize the ideals of the Crpd and the SGD. Countries in the English-speaking Caribbean have a very far way to go in the context of employment, and the time for action is now. Making cities and communities inclusive for persons with disabilities. For us to have an inclusive, equitable, and prosperous Caribbean for all, communities, towns, and cities have to be more inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. This is a developmental necessity if persons with disabilities are to be fully integrated into the society and become a part of the productive capacity of their country. Unfortunately, none of the three countries under review can boast of being fully accessible to persons with disabilities. Admittedly, the colonial experience of these countries, again, have left buildings and public facilities inaccessible to persons with disabilities. In the construction and design of communities, towns, and cities, no special efforts were made to include persons with disabilities in the colonial era. Since the 1970s, however, we have seen a slight change in this approach. In Jamaica, for example, the National Housing Trust has an established policy to make a minimum of 5% of its housing in each housing development accessible for persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities have been accessing these houses and are therefore being integrated in those communities. Additionally, in the 2017 budget debate just concluded in the Parliament, Prime Minister Andrew Holness announced an initiative to provide assistance through the NHT for households that have individuals with disabilities, the disability housing grants, so that they can make modifications to their housing. This is to assist with the necessary modification that is needed for persons with disabilities. The lack of a building code to establish set guidelines for the construction and design of facilities in communities, towns, and cities have exacerbated the problem of access to public facilities throughout the region. In Jamaica, the bill is being debated in the Parliament, and when promulgated, will bring into effect a new building code. This building code will make it mandatory for new buildings to be made accessible for persons with disabilities. In countries such as Barbados, there was a problem with accessing facilities in communities, towns, and cities for persons with disabilities. However, due to the increase in the population of physically disabled persons, governmental efforts are being made to improve access to public facilities for persons with disabilities. The building code in Barbados makes special provision for buildings to be constructed with the relevant access features for persons with disabilities. On a progressive note, we have seen where efforts are being made to improve public transportation for persons with disabilities in the major cities. In the 3 countries identified in this paper. Special buses have been included in the public transportation system for persons with disabilities. However, persons living with a disability in rural communities do not have access to these facilities. And herein lays a major dilemma for persons with disabilities, because most of the access to public transportation is based in the major cities. And based on my assessment, I have come up with some recommendations for consideration, and I will go through quickly. If the CRPD and the MDGs are to be realized, urgent action must be taken to make the Caribbean an inclusive, equitable, and prosperous place for persons with disabilities. In this context, the following are some recommendations that must be implemented in order for this noble mission to be accomplished. 1, for governments to make at least one primary and high school in each electoral constituency or district accessible for persons with disabilities. 2, for governments within the region to provide free tuitions for persons with disabilities up to the tertiary level. 3, for governments to provide grants to persons with disabilities to purchase assistive technology to aid in their education and employment endeavors. 4, for governments to incentivize the private sector through tax credits for employing persons with disabilities. 5, a special pool of funds to be established by government and private sector to provide loans/grants for small business development for persons with disabilities. 6, for governments to provide tax exemption for transport operators to purchase accessible motor vehicles for persons with disabilities. 7, for building codes to be established to ensure that the public facilities are made accessible to persons with disabilities. 8, for multilateral and bilateral institutions to specifically indicate that persons with disabilities are to benefit from a percentage of loans/grants that they provide to governments within the region. And if that don't happen, persons with disabilities are not going to be included in the development agenda based on assistance being given from external forces. 9, for special training and sensitization programs to be put in place for public officers, especially those in education, justice, health, labor, public transportation, and housing on issues relating to persons with disabilities. 10, to engage non-governmental organizations catering to persons with disabilities in modern management techniques, and how to mobilize resources for their organization. 11, to create an independent national mechanism to monitor the implementation of the CRPD and the SDGs in the context of persons with disabilities. 12, and final, to improve data collection mechanisms for persons with disabilities by ensuring that specific questions relating to persons with disabilities are included in national censuses, and to create national registration for this vulnerable group. I thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Morris, for in particular reminding us of the crucial link between inequalities and getting rid of inequalities and the SDGs, SDG 4, SDG 8, SDG 10, 11, and in particular 17. I think we're 2-0 in terms of presentations that are giving us very solid overviews as well as very practical and down-to-earth recommendations. Just want to again suggest, propose, and indicate that even as we talk about these recommendations and we speak about these patterns of disadvantage, we have to remember that these are associated with different social positions. And so the intersectionality of these disadvantages, of these social structures, being gender and inequality, represent a very unique platform for us to be able to present some very solid recommendations. So from what I heard things like what are the patterns, that we have this inadequate conceptualization, inadequate recognition and response. And we know that there are certain hierarchies that stymie the enjoyment of rights of those persons with disabilities, and we know that there are multiple discriminators. One of the things that came to me, for example, is that we're not even sure how violence affects women in particular with disabilities right now. As we talk about, we always talk about women and violence against women, and yet we need to pay more attention to those who stand at that intersection. I now have the pleasure of calling to the podium a colleague from UNFPA who is from the regional office of that organization in Panama, Mr. Federico Tobar.
Thank you, Alison. As Alison said, my name is Federico Tobar. I am Argentinian, and I am a health economist. And I am here to talk with you about the SDG 3 Target 7, which is the one that aims to reach universal access to reproductive health. But let me tell you that as a health economist, I was disappointed because a few days after coming to UNFPA, the United Nations Funds of Populations, I heard by one of our senior manager an advice, and he said to be aware that economic arguments could be against our mandate, our mission in UNFPA, because our mission is related to the defense of reproductive rights, of population rights, and he thought that maybe economic arguments could register a trade-off, could affect the reaching of reproductive rights. So at this time, I wonder if I was not the wrong person in the wrong place at this moment, because what a health economist can do in an organization that thinks that they had to be reluctant to economic arguments. So I am here today to try to show you how can health economics helps decision-making in reproductive health, particularly in the SDG 3 Target 7, and particularly for Caribbean countries. So, by starting, from my point of view, health economics is the area of economics worried about how to produce health efficiently and how to distribute health equitably. So if we want to apply this analysis to reproductive health, of course we have to find the most efficient ways to reach reproductive health objectives, and we have to answer what can we do for assuring equitable distribution of those reproductive objectives, of those outcomes. And going directly to the SDG 3 Target 7, we have two official indicators for measuring our advancements toward this SDG. And the first one is the proportion of women of reproductive age who have their need for family planning satisfied with modern contraceptive methods. And the second one is the adolescent birth rate. And I will try to analyze those indicators from a health economics perspective. You know, the first one, the proportion of women of reproductive age who have their needs for family planning satisfied with modern contraceptives, is indeed a derivative indicator from one basic indicator, which is the prevalence of modern contraceptives. So the first analysis that we have to do is to analyze how are we in terms of prevalence of modern contraceptives. And this is what I am trying, let me check. Yeah, I guess you can see that. Let me show you how are our countries, or your countries, because I am not a Caribbean guy, as you know. The average temperature in my country today is 0 degrees, you know. And, well, here you can see Caribbean countries in orange, Latin American and the Caribbean as a whole region in brown, color brown, and the rest of developing regions in color blue. In a simple analysis, you can see that our countries are, or your countries are a head and a shoulder above the rest in terms of these indicators. What does it mean? It means that it will be harder each day to conquest an expansion in the coverage of modern contraceptives. I mean, to reach the SDG 3, Target 7, in terms of this particular indicator, will be really hard. And it will be really hard to persuade international donors to spend in our countries in order to help us to reach this indicator, this goal. For a more in-depth analysis, you have here the evolution over the time of the modern contraceptive prevalence rate. We know that in every country, every single country, the prevalence rate of modern contraceptives start in a lower level with very slow advancement, and in a certain point it reaches an acceleration, and after a new point, it starts to leveling off, and it will be harder to get more advancements. And this third point, in which a third phase, the higher modern contraceptive prevalence rate starts, and in which will be harder to get conquest, to get more advancement, starts around 50% of prevalence. And as you can see in this chart, most of Caribbean countries are in the higher part of this curve. This last curve is the same that I show you, but it includes only the Latin American and Caribbean countries. As you can see, we are showing here the last part, the third phase of this curve with S-shaped curve, you know. And as you can see there are only 5 countries in our region that are still in the second phase, a phase which we can call increasing marginal returns. And most of our countries, and particularly most of Caribbean countries, are in the third phase, which is a phase of diminishing marginal returns. In a nutshell, it means that if we try to persuade a donor that it will be efficiently to invest in expanding access for reproductive health in our countries, it will be very difficult to us. It will be very hard, because other countries are in the previous phases, you know. So if they spend money in these countries, they will get more value for this money than in our countries. But not everything is a bad news for you. If we consider the second indicator, which is the adolescence birth rate, as you can see in this chart, the situation of the Caribbean countries are not so far from the rest of the Latin American and Caribbean region as a whole, and from the rest of developing regions. The most important thing from my point of view here is the huge differences, the gaps that we register among countries here. You know, we have countries like Jamaica, which are in a best situation, and we have countries like Guyana or well, you can see here particularly Guyana and Belize, which are registering higher levels of adolescent birth rate. But in this case, we can suspect that could be easiest to persuade not only donors, international donors, but also governments to invest in preventing unintended adolescent pregnancies. But what can the health economics do to help this advocacy? Let me show you the toolkit of health economics assessment. From my point of view, it is like an onion. As you know, we have layers of analysis, and as long as we are going to the center of this onion, we're getting closer to the best evidence-based decision. I would like to remark that there are not a single and universal economic assessment. Every economic assessment depends on what we want to analyze, what we want to compare, and which variables are we consider in this analysis. So I will try to show you 3 different layers of analysis related to the health economics of adolescent pregnancy. The first one is very well known, and it is made by the Guttmacher Institute, and they have demonstrated that $1 that we spend in contraceptions generates savings in the order of 1.47 in attending this pregnancy. This is a simple first layer of analysis. But you know, if we consider not only this moment, not only the cost of providing protection against unintended pregnancies for adolescents and the cost of attending this birth at this moment, but if we consider that if we can delay, if we can postpone a pregnancy in a girl that it is today 15 years old until she is 19 years old, these savings are around $10. And if we consider, in addition, other expenditures, not only direct medical expenditures, we can save more than that. In a third layer, we consider other evidences like the income of this mother. If this girl that is 15 years old now is pregnant, maybe she will drop out the school, or maybe she will take more time to finish school. And probably her income along her life intercourse could be lower than if we made a common or a traditional study, and if she can finish her high school at the age of 17 or 18. And probably she will pay less taxes to the government. So in order to persuade governments that this investment could provide them returns, a recently study made in El Salvador demonstrated to the government that spending today in postponing a teenage pregnancy from 15 to 19, to the age of 19, generates return to the government in terms of tax revenue with a cost-benefit margin of 2.1. And it is higher if we can postpone this birth until the age of 24 years. So I guess this kind of argument, this kind of statement can help us to persuade governments. And if you are interested in your countries, we can help you to make this kind of research for generating this data. So in conclusion, let me tell you that if at the moment I came to UNFPA, I felt that I was the wrong person in the wrong place, now I guess that this kind of approaches start to be useful, are starting to be useful. And I heard recently the same person that gave us that advice to be reluctant to economic arguments to say that in the current phase of the construction of reproductive rights, conquests do not depend on innovation, on medical innovation or on technology innovation, but in our ability to persuade governments to adopt the right political decision, and incorporating tools and arguments provided by the health economics to the rights approach can be useful for advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. I don't believe in coincidences, but I thought what a way to end talking about how we need to engage governments directly through the political process, and therefore begging the question as to what is the role of all of us, civil society, advocates, and others like you and I, who are in this vineyard toiling, and how we can engage and strategize, and what kind of tactics we need to use in order to ensure that the government is listening and is responsive. May I properly recognize Honorable Sarah Flood-Bobron, Minister of Foreign Affairs in St. Lucia, who arrived just a short while ago. Welcome, Minister. So I think you arrived at the right time to hear the charge to the government. So, questions and hopefully some answers of the presenters. Now, our chairs are now at the podium, finally. So I don't know if the presenters want to come forward, because I think there's a mic at the front, so it would be easier. Maybe I could start the questions. Federico, I totally understand what you're saying, but what is it in particular about the health economics approach, those tools and those arguments, that is different? Because we've been working on this for a long time. We have, and especially in the Caribbean, in terms of our adolescent pregnant. No, so the fertility rate has dropped, but it's still very, very high. What is the particular insight that you think comes from your discipline, which can help us turn the corner on this?
Okay. May I answer now?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I guess that we can use this onion toolkit to make an economic assessment on the different interventions we can promote in order to preventing adolescent unintended pregnancies. And now the most useful technology are the LARCs, which are the modern contraceptives that have a long duration. And those LARCs, as you know, are not all of them. The IUD is a cheaper contraceptive, but the implants, which are the most demanded now, are very costly. They cost between $8.5 until $200. It depends on where the country is purchasing it, contraceptive. So the health economics can help governments to make a proper economic assessment of how much could cost to prevent an unintended adolescent pregnancy, and which could be the economic impact of this prevention.
Thank you, Federico. So it helps us to establish the bottom line. And the bottom line is what governments, especially in a highly indebted region, have to pay attention to.
Just one of the recommendations which I saw, which I think perhaps ought to be changed because it would, I think, defeat the purpose that we are trying to achieve. Mr. Morris, right? You were suggesting that in each electoral district, perhaps one school would be well adjusted to ensure that there is disability access. I really don't think that that would help the cause. There's no reason why every school can't be. We have to put our money where our mouth is. Because if we're going to select one school at least, it would mean that we would be further stereotyping, because we will limit right away the disabled person to that school. And that may not be the best school. And what we're trying to achieve is to ensure that disabled persons have equal access. And of course, I gather that you're suggesting that because things are so bad, at least let's start with one. But I say no, let's do everyone and let's put our money where our mouth is. It's about priorities and making sure we put money where we need to put it. So I just wanted to suggest that to you. So we aim for what the ideal is right away and not make excuses for governments who find monies to do all sorts of things that are less important. The other question I wanted to just ask Mr. Toba, some of our countries are actually facing very low fertility rates. St. Lucia, for example, has the lowest rate of decline in the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've had to, in fact, close some schools down because they are just not children to put in there. And I know that is some of the concerns that the health economists have and the economists generally because of the whole idea of our aging populations, etc. How can NFPA assist in tailor-making solutions to suit the particular needs of countries? Some countries may need to reduce their fertility rates, some may need to increase their fertility rates. So how would NFPA respond to the specific country need and place resources, allocate resources accordingly? Thank you.
First, I want to say just a small point, because those of us in the community of persons with disability really frown on some of the nomenclatures that are used to refer to us. You see, so the term differently able, I don't know where that has evolved from and who it's referring to, but we're satisfied with persons with disabilities.
Thank you for educating me, I appreciate
That. Secondly, Minister, which is the more substantive point, and I take your observation and you and I are at Edem with it, eh? But the experience of us in the community of persons with disabilities is of such that there is a lot of chattering in the Caribbean where policymakers are concerned as it relates to the issue of disabilities. And we know that they are going to be hard-pressed to get all schools accessible for persons with disabilities. And that is where we want to go, okay? So I have no objection with that ultimate idea. But as a starter, we have to make sure that we get some of these educational institutions accessible. And I say, and when I say one institution, I'm talking about a primary school, a high school in those districts being made accessible. And then over time you would have the multiplication of it, because if you look and see the building codes that are being executed now require new buildings to be built with the access features. So those are not the problem. Where you have the problem is the old institutions that have been constructed over the years and have not been built with the requisite accessibility features. Those are the institutions that we need to modify, and those are the institutions that I am referring.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I guess that it shows a new worry we will have, an increasing worry we will have, because if what we want is that the potential of every young person is fulfilled, now UNFPA have to prioritize the question of the unintended adolescent pregnancies. But if a country like St. Lucia maybe is advanced in terms of the demographic transition, these problems are, the importance of those problems are lower than in other countries, and what we have to assume is a different approach focused on welfare of the population, and particularly for us in terms of our mission in UNFPA, in terms of the investment in adolescent and young people. So what we are doing now is trying to measure public investment in each country in adolescent and young people, and trying to identify best practice in terms of public policies that contribute to the welfare of adolescents and young people. And in some countries, these good practices are related to avoid migration of young people, is to reduce violence. There are different approaches, not always exclusively related to the fertility rate or particularly the adolescent pregnancy. So as long as we are going to move forward a better situation, we are going to increase our agenda of objective, but always related to the welfare of the women and the youngs.
I want to thank the participants for what has been a very informative panel, the topic of which is reducing inequities. And we can see in relation to the focus on disabilities that there's clearly that thrust towards reducing inequities. But within the inequities that face the disabled community, and Alison made reference to it, are inequities that overwhelm the life of women and young girls. And I wondered to what extent and what does it need to take to focus on this aspect? Because the whole matter of gender inequity, I think our friend from the UNFPA has spoken about this. But how does that factor into your solution? And what are the specific inequities that face women and girls that you think your lobbying efforts should be concerned with? That's the first question. And the second is, what role do you see for civil society in this major task that we are all confronted with in relation to the issues that have been raised in your respective presentations? Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. And I can just attack on, I had a similar question that I was going to ask, but what I wanted to ask, in your organizations, of which you're a part, in the community, Floyd, in your advocacy, Mr. Brathwaite, how do we incorporate this gender perspective, and how does it play out in terms of how you engage with the issue? Why? And in terms of the specific whats that come to the fore when we apply the gender lens.
Okay, all right. Mr. Brathwaite put me to back first. Thanks, Alison, and thanks, Lynette. Good to see you again. No doubt the situation of gender and the role of women and girls play a critical role in the whole landscape of persons with disabilities. But you know, coincidentally, I was looking at some data the other day, and the survey that I was looking at is pointing to more males with disabilities in the Jamaican population as compared to that in terms of Barbados. And what happened is that I believe that the levels of violence and accidents on Jamaican road is contributing to more males in the population of persons with disabilities. But notwithstanding that, in terms of the advocacy in the community of persons with disabilities in Jamaica, if you look at all the major non-governmental organizations serving the population, you will notice that they are being led by females with disabilities, because they are more strident, they are more articulate, they are more assertive in terms of putting forward the issues as it relates to persons with disabilities. And I have not come across yet, I'm not saying it's not there, but a specific gender-related study as it, no, I think Dr. Leith Dunn is working on something as it relates to the whole gender perspective where persons with disabilities are concerned. I haven't accessed that data as yet, but there is need for significant work to be done to look at the situation of women and girls with disabilities in Jamaica. As it relates to the question that you asked about the role of civil society in terms of persons assisting the advocacy of persons with disabilities, they have a fundamental role. And as a matter of fact, I believe that that is what has been lacking to give the work of the disabled community greater impetus, because it is persons with disabilities who are by and large leading the charge in terms of their own advocacy. And yes, it has to come from them, but in order to magnify and give a greater voice to what they are advocating for, I think civil society groups need to come on board to assist in that regard. So take, for example, we have the Disabilities Act that has been passed in the Parliament from 2014. And it is yet to be effected because the minister with responsibility for the sector is not in a position to sign the effective date. And it's not her fault by and large, right? It is what is to take place and the bureaucratic bundling that is taking place and stymieing the advancement of this critical piece of legislation. And we need the voices of civil society to put pressure on the bureaucrats to make sure that they accelerate the things that need to be put in place to make the Jamaica Council for Disabilities a body corporate, and the reforms that has to go on at that entity, the whole establishment of the Disability Rights Tribunal, where complaints are going to be taken by persons with disabilities when their rights are violated. The only thing that has taken place so far is the appointment of the board to oversee the the JCPD, which is a part of the legislation, and the minister has carried out her function where that is concerned. But the other things that need to be done in terms of the energy from the bureaucracy, that is languishing. And civil society needs to play a role in that.
Thanks, Floyd.
All right, so I will jump in on the need to, when looking at gender generally, to have a subset within that data set which looks at the intersection of gender and disability. So for example, in the Barbados labor policy and the human resource development strategy, there's greater calls for disaggregation of data by sex. But of course, what we're going to miss when we only disaggregate it in that way is this intersection. So that's where our data set has to become more inclusive so that we know how do the peculiarities of gender and disability intersect. Now, my research discloses that gender plays out in terms of employment. So you find more women with disabilities are engaged in the public sector as compared to men with disabilities being self-employed. So that's one of the dynamics that we then also have to take into account when looking at framing policy, where are persons with disabilities working, because again, a huge part of our problem lies in the failure of our education system, because the data also then discloses that persons with disabilities ultimately work in jobs which require primary and secondary skill sets. So that, of course, that also then has an influence on earning capacity, etc. Now, I know in Barbados, UNFPA worked with National Council for Disabilities in having a program which looked at reproductive health rights of persons with disabilities, and they focused in on that because of, again, the interrelation there. So I know that there is work which is being done on that front. Now, as it relates to Ever Able, what we've been looking at is ensuring that in all of our policy framing, we're looking at not just, we've had the hard task of being purposefully intersectional, because policy making at first brush, without doing that hard work, is much quicker. But our concerns look at not just gender, but how does gender then interrelate with access to tertiary education? How do the class differences play out? So that is to say that there is a small body of work, certainly in the context of Barbados and Trinidad to a lesser extent, which shows the interrelationship between gender and disability, but there is a need for so much, the absence of baseline data across the board makes it terribly impossible to know, well, let's advocate for this policy, and we know that this policy is working. And in the context of increasingly strained budgets, then the case to be made is made that much harder.
Thank you. Federico, do you want to say anything? No? All right.
I guess that I don't have anything new to say to you. I guess you know much more than me about this. But as you know, the United Nations Population Fund is the United Nations agency which aims that every pregnancy is wanted, every birth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. So our mission is directly related with girls and women. And in terms of civil society organizations, we work closer with civil society organizations as partners, as allies, as providers of service. So we are in the same field.
If I may just make one addition. Part of the challenge of, and this is from my observations of advocacy in Barbados particularly, is the very clear sectoral approaches that we take. So we're very distinct in our advocacy. And the absence of that broad-based coalition. So when NO speaks, the National Organization for Women, NO must also speak for disabled women. And in the absence of those coalitions, then it makes the pushing that much harder. So in the fundamental failure of much of our public policy, we're dealing with a broad set of demands from, okay, we need accessible buildings, we need accessible transportation, we need accessible cities. We need all of these things so that the work of advocacy has to be distributed, even when it is not your direct concern per se. That intersectional approach has to then move. So as Senator was saying, we have to push the work of greater inclusion from an exclusive concern of persons with disabilities into the work of all of us.
And just to add and support what you're saying, because the whole issue of disability is bound to impact on all of us in the society at some point in time. Because disability is something that can happen to any of us at any point in time. So we have to make sure that we prepare ourselves for any eventuality. You know, I have known individuals who have been at work, slip, and end up in problems. I remember a parliamentarian having to do some knee replacement. And for a while, it found it extremely difficult to enter the parliament building. And so he had an experience of what it is to have a physical disability and to climb those stairs where there's no lift, right? And so when you look at the sidewalks, and how inaccessible they are, this is something that is going to impact not just the wheelchair user, the blind person, but it's bound to impact on the senior citizen, right? It's going to impact on the pregnant woman who is going to be walking from time to time and going to the supermarket with the trolleys and so forth, having serious challenges. So it's bound to impact on everybody. So that is why disability is everybody's business. It's not just for the person who is living with the disability.
Thank you very much. Maybe that's a good note on which to end. My clock says it's 6 o'clock. I'll take one more question if we need to, or if we wish to. I'm entirely at your disposal. However, I think we've had a very robust discussion, and essentially what I hear coming out is that in public policy, in terms of reducing inequalities, whether it's public policy, whether it's advocacy, whether it's data collection and gathering, we not only have to disaggregate, but we must take in the intersectionality of everything so that we look at these multiple discriminations. We look at the range of issues that are stymieing the enjoyment of our fundamental human rights. And we also have to ensure that we have strong intersectoral coalitions that are able to change, tackle, challenge these patterns of disadvantage that are associated with our social positions, whether that is as men, women, children, or persons with disabilities. I have to say that, Federica would know this, that there are many countries in the world where you have forced sterilization of women with disabilities. So this is something that we as Floyd says, we all need to take into account. May I thank you all very much for attending this session and participating so fulsomely. May I thank the presenters for your most excellent presentations that helped us to better understand and hopefully respond to in the future.